from the very moment he ascended the throne at just 17 years old. Henry VIII wasn't just aiming to rule, he was aiming to rewrite the rules entirely. And he did. What followed wasn't a peaceful reign of diplomacy and measured governance, but a full-blown roller coaster of obsession, indulgence, betrayal, broken marriages, and one of the most radical religious overhauls in English history. This wasn't just a king with a sword. This was a king who rewrote scripture to suit his romantic needs, who spared no coin for his appetite or his ego, who had a court so lavish that even his hunting dogs wore velvet collars stitched with golden thread, and who sealed the fate of queens with nothing more than a nod. Henry didn't just want to rule, he wanted to be remembered as the center of the universe. No matter who had to bleed for it. Most people only remember the headlines: 6 wives, 2 beheaded, and a chubby king who ate too much and died alone. But the real story runs deeper and far darker. This was a monarch who rewrote the very faith of his nation, just so he could marry a woman who later rejected him in both heart and bed. He penned love letters by candlelight to Anne Boleyn, each signed with a ciphered heart, pledging loyalty, begging for her body and soul, and promising to discard all other women if she would only surrender herself to him. He swore she would be his only mistress, his only queen. But that same woman, once adored beyond reason, would be condemned to die by his very hand. And when it came time to kill her, Henry VIII, the showman, didn't settle for the local executioner. He ordered a skilled swordsman from France to ensure a swift, clean blow. Not for mercy, but for spectacle, and perhaps to spare himself the guilt of hearing her scream. In his early years, Henry was no glutton. He was athletic, strong, a knight in every sense. He loved jousting, feasting, hunting, and oh, how he loved feasting. At his first Christmas as king, in the year 1509, he reportedly spent £7,000 on a banquet that included swan and peacock. The kind of meal that made ordinary men look like beggars and made his own legend grow with every bite. As the years passed, injuries and illness stole his agility, but not his appetite. By the end of his life, he weighed close to 400 pounds, suffering from open-leg ulcers and barely able to walk.
Your king, and you will obey me.
Still, he insisted on royal excess dogs in crimson velvet, collars bearing his arms, and banquets fit for an emperor, all funded by a treasury that groaned under the weight of his ego. But more than his feasts, more than his wives, and even more than his wars, Henry's most lasting impact was religious, and it all started with rejection. When the Pope refused to annul his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry didn't just protest, he burned the bridge, lit the torches, and built his own church. In the year 1534, he passed the Act of Supremacy, naming himself supreme head of the Church of England, tearing his country away from centuries of Catholic tradition, just so he could marry Anne Boleyn. Love had never been more dangerous, faith had never been so disposable, and the king had never looked more unstoppable. And yet, for all his power and bravado, Henry could not control the one thing that always escaped him: love. His wives came and went. Some divorced, some beheaded, some buried, and his court became a place not of safety, but of dread. Even his friendships turned sour. Even his daughters feared him. He roamed the halls of his palaces, like a shadow in his final years, surrounded by dogs, more loyal than any human ever dared to be. He who once disguised himself to walk among his people and hear their praise, could no longer even climb stairs without help. The laughter faded. The cheers stopped. All that remained was the weight of his body, of his guilt, of his legacy. And yet that legacy remains, carved into every book, every documentary, every whispered tale of Tudor madness. Henry VIII, the king who married 6 times, beheaded queens, seduced mistresses, rebranded God, and spared no one. Not even the women he once claimed to love, not even the soul of his own kingdom. He didn't just leave a mark, he left a wound. One that bled for generations. One that still echoes through the stones of the tower, through the stained glass of churches that once bent to Rome, but now bow to London. He was no ordinary king. He was a man too big for his throne, too hungry for one wife, too proud for one faith, and too blind to see the ghosts that followed every decision he made. This is Henry, not the myth, not the bloated cartoon, but the man who rewrote the nation, remade religion, and reminded the world what happens when love turns to power, and power turns to blood. When Henry VIII was still new to the throne, young, burning with pride, and hungry for legacy, and the world saw in him the bright face of England's future. The year was 1510, and he had only just begun to wear the crown that had once weighed heavily on the head of his father. Henry VII, the boy who had studied languages, theology, music, and philosophy, now sat on a throne with the weight of a kingdom in his hands. And though he was young, barely past 17, the fire in him burned like that of an emperor. He was not patient like his father. He was not cautious like his council. Henry wanted glory. And more than anything, he wanted to be seen not just by his people, but by the world. So when his advisors, in their careful, calculated way, decided to send a secret letter to the French King Louis XII without telling him, extending the olive branch of peace without the drama of war, they thought they were protecting the crown. But they had forgotten one thing: Henry was not a man who accepted silence. He was not born to be ignored. When Henry discovered the letter, it was not a quiet moment. He did not sit in a shadowed hall and sigh in disappointment. No, the young lion roared. His pride, barely contained in a court of sycophants and silken robes, burst like a fire set loose in dry fields. He shouted to his council, voice trembling with rage and disbelief. Who wrote this letter, I ask? Peace of the King of France. Who dare not look me in the face? Who dares make war on me? It was not just an insult. It was betrayal. And Henry, so young, so full of the need to prove himself, took that betrayal, not as a single act of diplomacy gone wrong. He saw it as a wound to his honor, a stain on his future. From that moment forward, France was not just a neighboring kingdom. It was a name carved into the bones of his ambition. So he made a show of his fury. The very next tournament, where knights and nobles would gather in glittering display to test their skill and entertain the crown, Henry ensured that the ambassador of France was denied a seat. It was a small act, a child's insult perhaps, but it spoke volumes in a world where every gesture was political theater. It was as if he had invited the whole world to his feast and left one chair empty, just to make sure everyone knew who had fallen out of favor. And so the message was sent. Henry VIII would not be treated as a boy. He would not be spoken over. He would not be hidden from the great game of power and pride that Europe played. But if France thought this was the end of the matter, they were wrong. The storm would only grow. 10 years later, in the year 1520, That storm swept across the Channel and arrived in the most theatrical of forms, a summit of kings so grand, so dazzling, so expensive, that it would go down in history as the Field of the Cloth of Gold, set in a valley near Calais. The land was transformed for weeks into a temporary paradise of tents stitched from golden fabric, fountains that flowed with wine, feasts that rivaled ancient Rome, and spectacles of sport, music, and royal games. Henry of England and Francis I of France, two young kings, two egos barely contained within their crowns, met, not just to talk of peace, but to measure each other like two great stags before a duel. Their kingdoms watched, their courts held their breath, and beneath every toast and handshake was a tremor of tension. A question no one dared speak aloud: who would come out of this encounter as the greater king? It was not diplomacy that would decide it. It was wrestling, in an act as bold as it was bizarre. Henry, ever the showman, challenged Francis to a wrestling match. Some said it was to show strength. Others whispered it was to settle the unspoken battle of youth and masculinity. And perhaps, beneath it all, it was Henry's way of reclaiming what he felt France had taken from him a decade before. The insult of the letter, the wound to his pride, the ambassador without a seat, all of it rested in his bones. So in the middle of the Cloth of Gold field, surrounded by nobles, courtiers, and the jeweled eyes of Europe, the two kings faced one another, and Francis threw him to the ground. Just like that, the King of France, slender, strong, and trained in the art of combat, brought the King of England to the dirt before the crowd. There was no cheering, no laughter, only a moment of stunned silence. And then the sound of silk rustling as Henry stood, brushing off the dust, his face unreadable. He did not rage. He did not strike back. He simply smiled, and then he carried on with the summit, as if nothing had happened. But something had cracked beneath the surface. And Henry, who could never forget a slight, not even in jest, buried that moment deep in the vault of his grudges. The summit itself accomplished little. The grand displays failed to secure any lasting peace. Within 1 year, England and France were at war once more. This time as part of the Italian conflict, historians would later call the 4 Years' War. Whatever wine had been shared, whatever dances danced, whatever gold had glittered between tents and thrones, it all washed away in the rain of cannon fire and broken treaties. And perhaps, in some corner of his soul, Henry was satisfied. War had returned. The game was real again. And the king who had been thrown to the ground would rise again. Not with fists, but with fire. Years would pass. Kings would fall. Wives would come and go. And still, the pride of that young Henry, humiliated before the world, lived on like a splinter beneath the skin of the throne. He never wrestled again in public. He never gave France the satisfaction of a second chance. But he never forgot. And in the pages of history, the Field of the Cloth of Gold remains not as a victory for peace, but as a stage where two kings danced, and one fell and never forgave. In the earliest days of his reign, Henry VIII glimmered like a golden boy carved by fate, tall, athletic, intelligent, and beloved. Courtiers praised his charm. Poets sang of his grace in tournaments, and commoners craned their necks in the streets to catch a glimpse of the young monarch whose smile seemed to promise a new and brighter age. But time, as it always does, reshaped the mirror in which Henry admired himself, and somewhere between the trumpets of victory and the silken trails of his wedding processions, the king who once raced horses and danced with queens began to feast not just on meats and pies, but on power, obsession, and fantasy. The hunger in him was never only physical, though that too would grow insatiable. It was a hunger to have more pleasure, more loyalty, more praise, more submission. And the king who once fasted for Lent with the humility of a monk would soon eat with the fury of an emperor who believed the world was his banquet. The year was 1509, and Henry had only just claimed the throne when he hosted his first royal Christmas feast. It was not a simple affair of roasted goose and carols by the hearth. No, Henry, even then, and felt the weight of his name pressing on his youth, and he wanted the court to know that this boy king would not live in the shadow of his cautious father. So he spent £7,000 on a holiday banquet, so extravagant that it passed into legend: swans roasted with gilded beaks, peacocks served with their feathers reattached and soaked in perfume, candied fruits arranged into golden towers, and flagons of wine that never emptied. It was a spectacle of indulgence that said one thing to every noble who watched in awe: there is no limit to what I will spend to be remembered. But what began as performance hardened into pattern. Henry's feasts grew longer, more frequent, more excessive, and while he was still young, his body managed to burn off the excess. He rode, hunted, jousted, sweating through silks and armor with the energy of a man who still thought himself immortal. His daily intake hovered around 5,000 calories, a sum that would alarm a physician even in the modern age. But the energy he burned kept pace with the food he devoured. And for a time, he wore his appetite as just another proof of his vitality. A feast was not only nourishment, it was celebration, command, and power. A theater where he reigned not only as monarch, but as god of the table. Time, however, is the enemy of indulgence. In the decades that followed, Henry's once athletic frame thickened, then bloated, then betrayed him entirely. A jousting accident in 1536 left him with a leg injury that never healed, and worse still, reopened in later years to become a festering ulcer that refused to close. The man who once leapt into saddles now had to be hoisted onto horseback with pulleys and ropes, his legs wrapped in bandages, his gait reduced to a lurching hobble, his armor custom-made to contain the girth of a king whose weight had surpassed 400 pounds. And yet, the feasting continued. The contrast between the sickly monarch and the opulence of his table became more grotesque with each passing year. Meals stretched for hours. Dishes came in waves, boar's head glazed in honey, custards carved with the royal seal, sweetmeats so delicate they could melt on the tongue. At Hampton Court and Whitehall, his kitchens became empires of their own, staffed by entire armies of cooks, butchers, bakers, brewers, carvers, and servers. One could live and die in Henry's kitchen and never see the king's face. So vast was the operation of feeding a monarch who no longer moved freely, yet insisted on eating like a lion before battle. And yet, the excess did not stop with his own plate. For Henry's animals, especially his dogs, were treated with a reverence and luxury that spoke volumes about his shifting priorities. The royal kennels were no mere shelters. They were chambers of nobility in miniature. His hunting hounds, greyhounds of noble bloodlines, were outfitted with collars made of crimson velvet and cloth of gold, adorned with locking spikes and bearing the insignia of the crown. 2 of the collars, meticulously recorded in the royal inventories, even bore the king's arms. These were not pets, but courtiers in their own right. They wore the symbols of the monarchy around their necks, while the people outside the palace walls starved through bad harvests and rising taxes. It was said half in jest, half in bitterness, that Henry's dogs dressed better than his soldiers. He kept these animals close. In his later years, as the court grew quiet and his moods turned inward, Henry often surrounded himself not with people but with hounds. Loyal, wordless, obedient. They never betrayed him, never questioned his decisions, never reminded him of what he had once been. And so while ministers fretted over crumbling finances and Parliament whispered of unrest, Henry ordered new fabrics for the kennels and new recipes for his table. There was a particular symbolism in it. All the king who could not walk without pain surrounded himself with creatures that ran freely in the woods, animals that represented the youth he had lost and the loyalty he could no longer find in men. And all the while, the treasury groaned. Wars with France and Scotland, endless construction of palaces, jewelry for queens he no longer loved, and banquets for holidays that blurred into one another. It all came at a price. Gold melted into waste, debts mounted. But Henry, perhaps blinded by his isolation, or perhaps simply unwilling to live with less than everything, continued. He would not downsize. He would not step back. He would go to his grave surrounded by food, silk, and velvet, if only to prove that a king did not bend to time. So in those last years, when his body festered and his courtiers held their breath at every change in mood, Henry sat in his great halls beneath painted ceilings, surrounded by goblets and gilded platters, the air thick with spices from the east, his hands swollen and ringed with rubies, his mind drifting between memory and denial. And beneath the table, his dogs silent, adorned, eternal companions rested at his feet, wrapped in velvet, eyes never judging, hearts never wavering. Thus the boy who once promised prosperity through strength had become the man who devoured his kingdom's future. Bite by bite, feast by feast, and though the records list the calories, the weight, the menus, and the collars stitched with gold, they do not record the silence of the people beyond the palace, or the hollowness that grew beneath the music of those endless meals. Henry fed himself, and he fed his dogs, but the soul of the nation that, perhaps, had long gone hungry, in the soft glow of candlelight, beneath beams darkened by centuries of smoke and secrets. A king once wrote love letters like a schoolboy dreaming at his desk. He did not dictate them to secretaries. He did not scrawl them in haste. Henry VIII, monarch of England, defender of the faith, man of appetite and command, sat with quill in hand and poured out his yearning onto parchment, not with the confidence of a ruler, but with the trembling sincerity of a man who believed his heart. Yes, even his heart might be refused. The woman he wrote to was no ordinary mistress. She was Anne Boleyn, sharp-eyed, sharp-witted, and unlike any other lady who had danced through the candlelit halls of the Tudor court, she did not yield. She did not swoon. She watched him with curiosity, resisted him with grace, and became the only woman in Henry's world who made love a war instead of a gift. The letters he sent her came thick with desire and royal desperation. He signed them with ciphers, a heart enclosing his initials, a code only she would read. In them, he pledged himself entirely, body and soul, promising to cast aside every other woman in his orbit, to serve Anne as his only mistress, to give her everything, even the crown if she would have it. These were not letters of power, though they came from the most powerful man in England. They were letters of longing, of need, of a kind of madness that begins when a man believes his fate lies not in the stars or on the battlefield, but in the smile of a woman who might never say yes. And for a time, Anne made him wait. She flirted and vanished. She returned and retreated. She turned courtship into chess. And Henry, who had never been denied anything, found himself ensnared. But what began as passion bloomed into obsession. And obsession, when worn by kings, rarely ends with peace. Henry wanted more than her affection. He wanted her at his side, in his bed, and above all, as his queen. There was only one problem. He already had a wife, Catherine of Aragon. His first queen had been loyal, noble, and barren. She had given him only one surviving child, the Princess Mary. And Henry, desperate for a male heir, grew restless. So he turned to the Pope, asking for an annulment, pleading that his marriage had never been valid. When Rome refused, Henry, emboldened by Anne's hold on his heart and mind, did the unthinkable. He broke from the Catholic Church, severed ties that had held for centuries, and declared himself the head of a new Church of England. It was the most seismic political act of his reign, and it was born not from diplomacy or doctrine, but from love, or the version of love that kings believe they are owed. In the year 1533, Anne Boleyn became queen. The court glittered with new hope. Henry had defied empires to possess her. He had changed religion, rewritten law, and cast aside friends and advisers who stood in his way. He believed, perhaps truly, that he had secured his destiny. But history does not grant mercy to fairy tales, and power does not soften the weight of disappointment. Anne did not give him a son. Their first child, Elizabeth, was bright and healthy, but female. Subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriage. And slowly, fatally, the magic curdled. Anne, once the star of Henry's world, became instead its problem. She was no longer a vision of love, but a mirror of failure. And in Henry's eyes, failure was treason. Whispers began to creep through court of flirtations, of lovers, of betrayal. Whether the rumors were true or conjured by enemies who despised her rise, they found fertile soil in a king who needed someone to blame. And Henry, who had once sent letters sealed with hearts, now summoned executioners. In the spring of 1536, Anne was arrested on charges so absurd they should have fallen apart with a single breath of truth. She was accused of adultery, incest, conspiracy against the crown, crimes stitched together not by facts, but by fear. Her brother George was dragged down with her. Men she had barely known were tortured into confessions. The court, once her stage, became a scaffold. But even in this, Henry could not simply kill her as any other traitor. No, he had to plan the ending with the same theatrical care he had once given to every banquet, every procession, every marriage vow. He ordered a swordsman to be brought from France, a man skilled in the clean execution of noble criminals. He chose this, not for kindness, but for spectacle. The axe was too common, the fire too slow, the sword sharp and foreign. I would do the deed swiftly. It would be remembered. Anne Boleyn, barely in her 30s, ascended the scaffold on the green within the Tower of London. Wearing a grey dress and an English gable hood, she spoke with calm that chilled the crowd, saying only that she would accuse no man, and asking God to save the king. A gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. Berlice, she said, words that stung with irony, whether or not she intended them to. She knelt, hands folded, neck bared to the morning air, and the sword flashed once. It was over. The man who had once written her poems now watched from behind stone in silence. He had not attended her execution, but he knew every detail, for he had written the orders himself. In a surviving warrant book discovered centuries later, his own words remained commanding that her head be cut off, and even specifying the spot upon the green where it was to be done. He had not burned her. He insisted, though it would have been within his right. He had spared her pain. He believed, but he had not spared her life. He had not spared her dignity, and he had not spared his own soul. For in taking Anne's life, he destroyed not only the woman he had once moved heaven and earth to possess, but the last flickering image of the man he had once been. The letters, if they still existed, were hidden. The hearts he drew beside his name faded into myth. All that remained was a name whispered through centuries: Anne Boleyn, and a king who once loved so deeply he changed the world, only to wake one morning and decide that love must die. In the quiet that followed her execution, even the court seemed to exhale. A new queen would be chosen. A new hope for a son would rise. But some shadows never lift. Some stories never truly end. And in the hush of history, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the rustle of parchment, the scratch of a pen, and the soft clink of a sword being drawn in the name of a heart that had turned to ice. It began with a painting, not a moment, not a gaze across a ballroom, not even a whispered letter, but a portrait sent across the sea, in which the woman appeared dignified, poised, and passably beautiful. That was enough for Henry. In the chill of the year, 1539, still raw from Anne Boleyn's execution and the death of Jane Seymour, his court urged him to remarry, to forge an alliance, to secure the realm once more with the promise of a living queen. And so they looked to Cleves, a small duchy in the German lands, offering not just another womb, but Protestant solidarity in the volatile chessboard of European power. Henry agreed to the match, but not blindly. Before wedding vows, he demanded something else: a meeting in disguise, a test of fate, a romantic gesture pulled from the worn pages of legend. And this is where it all began to rot. The woman's name was Anne of Cleves, and though her portrait by Holbein promised a demure elegance, what stepped off the barge that winter was, to Henry's eyes, an entirely different creature. He had expected grace. He had expected softness. He had expected to be stirred by something divine, something inevitable, the way he had once been stirred by Anne Boleyn's voice in a candlelit corridor. But what he saw instead was a stranger, pale, stiff, unfamiliar, and she did not recognize him. For Henry had come in disguise, dressed not as a king, but as a courtier, hoping to witness in her eyes that romantic spark, that instinctual knowledge that he was her destiny. He approached her with boyish bravado, perhaps even with trembling hands, and he leaned in to kiss her. She turned away. It was not cruel. It was not even strange by the customs of her land. She had no idea who this man was. But to Henry, who had crossed the threshold between political duty and romantic hope once again, it was a humiliation he could not forgive. The very idea that a woman, any woman, and especially one chosen by his ministers, and might recoil from his lips, was an offense that struck not at his pride, but at his core. And from that moment on, Anne of Cleves was no longer a bride to be admired, but an error to be corrected. Still, the wheels of court moved forward. The marriage, already arranged in ink and sealed by treaty, went ahead. In January of the year 1540, Henry and Anne were wed in a ceremony that felt, to the king, more like a funeral than a feast. He went to her bed that night, as custom and expectation demanded. But the morning after, he emerged sour-faced and silent. To his closest men, he muttered that the marriage had not been consummated. He said her body was not what he had hoped. He said her breath was foul, azzy hair, mana uncharming, her figure slack. Whether these words were true or conjured from his own revulsion is lost to time. What mattered was that Henry wanted out. What followed was less of a marriage and more of a negotiation. Henry, unlike in the past, did not pursue blood. He did not raise charge. He did not call for trials or whispers of betrayal. Instead, he leaned on his lawyers. He moved the machinery of annulment as coldly and precisely as if he were reassigning a property, not dissolving a royal union. In July of the same year, barely 6 months after the wedding, the marriage was declared invalid. Anne, perhaps wisely, did not resist. She accepted the decision with composure, agreeing to be called the king's beloved sister, and in return, she was granted lands, income, and the rarest prize of all, safety. It was a strange, almost tender ending to what had been a political disaster. Anne of Cleves lived out her days in England, respected, untouched, and unforgotten. She attended court on occasion, wrote letters to her family, and watched as queens came and went, one beheaded, another dead in childbirth, a final one who would outlive the king. She died many years later, in the year 1557, as the last surviving wife of Henry VIII, and though her marriage to him lasted less than a year, her survival, her quiet, to dignified refusal to resist, marked her as something rarer than a queen, a woman who escaped him whole. But Henry, in the aftermath, felt no romance, no regret, no softness. To him, Anne had become a symbol of misjudgment, a painting that lied, a kiss that faltered. He never trusted portraits again, and he never again met a bride in disguise. This episode, brief, almost comical in the retelling, reveals more about the king than many of his grander triumphs or darker crimes. Here was a man who believed, still, after so many broken hearts and silenced voices, that love would announce itself like a trumpet call, that destiny could be seen in a face, that kings should not be kissed only with consent, but with prophecy, and when prophecy failed him, he recoiled and declared the story broken. He wanted love to be perfect on the first breath. He wanted desire to bloom without effort. He wanted, above all, to be wanted, and when he was not even for the blink of a moment, he withdrew. He turned cold. He called his council. He erased what had barely begun. And Anne of Cleves, in the span of a season, went from Queen of England to a royal sister, with lands and liberty, quietly excused from history's stage before the curtain had even risen. Yet the lesson lingered in the folds of his court, in the strained smiles of his ministers, in the lowered eyes of future brides. Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was not a tragedy. It was not a love affair gone sour. It was a farce with golden edges, a parade without music, a kiss without meaning, and it reminded the world, once more, that Henry VIII did not want partners. He wanted fate to smile upon him. Or not at all. There are deaths in history that arrive with thunder on the battlefield, in the fire, through rebellion and smoke. But then there are those that descend quietly, like velvet shadows, planned not in panic, but in polished ink. Drawn not with rage, but with decision. The execution of Anne Boleyn was not the act of a man overcome by jealousy or grief. It was the result of a calculation, a cold unraveling of love, and faith, and power, by a king who believed that history should always obey his will. And so, when Henry VIII decided that his second wife must die, he did not pace the halls in tears, nor did he cry out in anguish. He summoned a swordsman from France. The choice of weapon was not an accident. In England, traitors were beheaded with the axe heavy, brutal, and uncertain. One blow might not be enough. Sometimes it took two, sometimes three. The body would twist, the blood would spray, and the court would tremble. But Henry, in the spring of the year 1536, did not want a spectacle of suffering. He wanted precision. He wanted silence. He wanted the moment to pass like the fall of a curtain, clean, rehearsed, controlled. So he ordered a man, famed for his skill and speed, to cross the channel. A swordsman, not for war, not for rebellion, but for the neck of a woman he had once called his only love. Anne Boleyn had known something was coming long before her arrest. The air around her had grown still. The laughter in her chambers had thinned. Eyes that once sparkled now looked away. She had miscarried again, this time a male child, and Henry had turned colder than winter stone. The court that had once bent at her feet now watched her with folded hands and unreadable expressions. She was queen. Yes, but she had no son. And in Henry's court, queens without sons were not crowned. They were erased. The charges came suddenly: adultery, incest, treason, so wild and desperate in their breath that even her enemies whispered doubts. They named men, one of them, her own brother George, and dragged them into cells with screams and iron. Confessions were beaten out or forged. Trials were held with conclusions already written. Anne, for all her wit and pride, I could do nothing. Her downfall had already been sealed in the king's heart. She was tried in the Tower, a queen judged like a servant, and found guilty by those who knew their survival depended on her death. But Henry, always obsessed with appearances, always staging, his legend would not allow her to die like others. He remembered how she had once refused him, then loved him, then ruled beside him. He remembered her French upbringing, her polished grace, her education in the courts of Europe. Perhaps, for one brief moment, he remembered how fiercely he had once loved her. So he granted her what he believed to be a mercy, death by the sword, not the axe. A faster end, a cleaner line, but still an end. And he gave instructions in the Tower's warrant book, discovered centuries later in the National Archives. His handwriting still echoes, calm, exact, unflinching. He commanded that her head be taken, that she not be burned, though the law allowed it. He even chose the site, the green within the Tower, open to the sky. But in the end, they moved it to a smaller platform, more discreet, less exposed. Even in death, Anne was being managed, not mourned, not remembered, managed. On the 19th of May, Anne Boleyn rose early. She dressed in gray damask, a cloak over her shoulders, and placed a small cap over her dark hair. She walked calmly to the scaffold, flanked not by family, but by the women assigned to her final hour. No music played, no crowd roared. The sun was soft, the air still. The swordsman had hidden his weapon beneath a bundle of straw. so she would not see it and flinch. He had rehearsed the blow. He had measured her neck with his eyes. He knew where to strike. Anne stood tall. She did not weep. She did not curse. Her final words were quiet, formal, almost surreal. "I am come hither to die," she said, "not to accuse any man, but to cleanse my soul." And then, in the line that history would never forget, "God save the king. Long may he reign." For never was there a gentler or more merciful prince. Whether she meant them or spoke them with bitter irony, no one knows. But the words fell like a benediction or a curse. She knelt. Her hands trembled only slightly. She prayed, and before the crowd could draw breath, the sword struck. There was no second blow. The queen's head fell into the straw. The body collapsed like cloth. A woman who had changed the fate of a nation, who had split a church in two, who had loved and bled and defied, now lay still upon the wood. The crowd said nothing. The wind whispered through the trees, and the blood pooled quietly at the base of the scaffold, as if it too had been rehearsed. Henry was not there. He was at Whitehall, preparing to ride to Jane Seymour. Before Anne's body was cold, before the Tower grass dried of her blood, the king was planning a wedding. Not a funeral, a wedding. The silence that followed in court was not sorrow. It was fear. If Anne, beloved, once beyond all measure, could be erased so quickly, what did that mean for those who served the crown? What safety was there in loyalty? What protection in truth? Ministers smiled with cautious lips. Courtiers bowed lower than before. The king had not just killed a queen, he had taught a lesson. And so the palace moved on. New dresses were sewn. New vows prepared. Jane Seymour would give Henry his son, though she would die soon after. And Anne Boleyn, buried in an unmarked grave beneath the Tower Chapel, was spoken of less and less. Her letters were hidden. Her portrait vanished. Her child Elizabeth grew up without a mother, and with a crown she would one day seize, as if to rewrite everything her father had undone. But in the stone of the tower, in the grain of the scaffold wood, in the rusted links of the chain that had once held her chamber door, the memory remained. The sword from France had left no scar on Henry's skin, but it had carved deeply into England's soul. And though the court would dine, and laugh, and march again in silks and triumphs, they would never again be able to say, with certainty, that love in the palace was anything more than a shadow waiting to be named. After Anne Boleyn's head had fallen, and her name had been lowered into silence, the court did not mourn. The curtains did not close. The palace, like a stage that never sleeps, simply rearranged its scenery and waited for the next act. And Henry, ever restless, ever watching, wasted no time in writing it. He had made himself both widower and judge, and before the last echo of Anne's execution had faded through the damp stones of the tower, he was already preparing to wed again. The king was not a man who sat with grief. He was a man who used it like parchment, something to write over, tear, and start anew. And so came Jane Seymour, the third Queen of England, in a line of women bound by his need for a son, his fear of legacy, and his unrelenting belief that love should never defy him. Jane was everything Anne had not been. Where Anne had sparkled with wit, challenged his mind, and tangled with politics, Jane was quiet, devout, and plain. Her obedience was her armor, her silence, her survival. In Jane, Henry saw not fire but stillness, and perhaps, after the storm Anne had brought, He mistook that stillness for peace. They married just 11 days after Anne's death. And in the court, there was neither celebration nor scandal. Only a kind of quiet horror, the numb understanding that queens were now interchangeable, that love could be replaced before the blood dried, and that the crown, once a symbol of divine favor, had become something more like a noose. But Jane did what neither Catherine nor Anne could. She gave Henry what he had craved for nearly 3 decades, a male heir. In October of the year 1537, she delivered Edward, a prince, a promise, a boy who carried the weight of a dying dynasty in his first breath. The kingdom exhaled. Henry wept with joy. And for a moment, a golden moment, he believed himself whole. He had his son. He had his legacy. He had the proof that God, after all, I might still be listening. But fate, always circling, never gives without taking. Less than 2 weeks after Edward's birth, Jane fell ill. Infection set in. Fever gripped her. And just 12 days after bringing life into the world, she left it. Henry mourned her deeply. Truly, perhaps for the first and only time in his life, Jane was never blamed, never hated, never scorned. She died a queen, a mother, a martyr to the cause of dynasty. And Henry, in his grief, ordered her buried beside him for eternity. She would become the only wife to share his tomb, not because she was loved most, but because she died before he could turn on her. In death, she was frozen in perfection, beyond disappointment, beyond betrayal. And the court, as always, moved on. 2 years passed. Henry aged, stiffened, widened. His leg, wounded in jousting, never healed, and the ulcers began to weep through the linen wrappings. He walked with difficulty. He avoided mirrors. His appetite grew monstrous. His temper, worse. But still, the crown demanded a queen. And so, in the year 1540, came Anne of Cleves, the queen who flinched when he kissed her, whose story had already played out like farce in the dim-lit corridors of political embarrassment. Her marriage lasted just 6 months. She gave no child, offered no spark, and was gone before the kingdom could blink. In this, she was lucky, for what followed her was blood again. Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, was barely in her teens when she caught the king's eye. Young, flirtatious, and beautiful in the way summer is all shine and no shadow, she was chosen to lift the king's spirits, to distract from the festering leg, the failing body, the whispers of mockery that now chased him through the halls. He called her his rose without a thorn. But youth does not always mean innocence. And Catherine's past, and perhaps her present, held secrets. When rumors reached Henry's ears of liaisons before and during the marriage, he did not question his own blindness. He questioned her virtue. And the penalty, as ever, was death. In February of the year 1542, Catherine followed Anne Boleyn's footsteps to the scaffold. She was no longer laughing. She asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her the night before, so she could practice laying her head, and in the morning, she said she died a queen, but would have rather died the wife of Thomas Culpeper, the man she had once loved in secret. The words, if they are true, they were both brave and fatal, for no queen could love another without tearing off her crown. Henry did not attend. He did not speak of her again. She became another chapter, another correction, another mistake to be silenced. By the time Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife, entered Henry's life, the king had become more monument than man. He was bloated, angry, riddled with disease. His once red hair had turned to pale whispers. His steps were slow, his moods unpredictable, but Catherine was clever, a widow, educated and cautious. She navigated the palace like a seasoned sailor in stormy waters. She debated theology with him. She cared for his children. She nursed him when the pain grew sharp, and most importantly, she survived. When Henry accused her of heresy, she fell to her knees and called herself a humble woman, unworthy to dispute the wisdom of her lord. And so, the warrant for her arrest was quietly withdrawn. She would not die. She would live to see his death. And when that day came in January of the year 1547, the court did not weep. It watched. It waited. Henry died, surrounded not by love, but by silence. His body, too vast and foul with infection, was difficult to move. His coffin cracked on the way to the tomb, and the man who had once shattered a church to pursue a woman, who had written love letters with hearts and sentenced queens to die with the stroke of a pen, was finally still. But the crown did not die with him. It passed, heavy with blood and dust, to the son he had fought so hard to have, Edward, a boy of 9, frail and doomed, and behind him, waiting in the wings, the daughters of the women Henry had used and discarded, Mary, the child of the cast-aside Spanish queen, and Elizabeth, the orphan of a beheaded mother. The legacy he had so desperately built was not the one he intended. It was not strength. It was not glory. It was not peace. It was women fierce, wounded, waiting, who would rise from the ashes of his reign and wear the crown with a grace he had never understood. Long after the feasts had ended, after the laughter of jesters had vanished into the dust of emptied halls, and after the swords had been sheathed and blood scrubbed from scaffold wood, the crown that Henry VIII had worn still gleamed, but now it sat uneasily atop the fragile head of a child. Edward, his long-awaited son, ascended the throne at 9 years old, too young to command and too ill to last. He was the boy for whom 2 queens had bled and 1 had died. A prince conjured into existence through longing, power, and cruelty. Yet when the kingdom looked at him, it saw not a savior, but a question. And as Edward's body weakened and his lungs filled with shadows, the weight of the Tudor legacy, the chaos Henry had left behind, began to settle not on a son, but on daughters. First came Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She had watched her mother discarded, her religion dismantled, and her own name stripped from the line of succession, all by the father who had once kissed her forehead and called her my pearl. She had lived in exile within her own country, not in chains but in silence, surrounded by servants who feared to speak her name with too much affection. But when Edward died, and others tried to steal the crown through quick arrangements and paper queens, Mary did not hide. She rode out, banner high, gathering supporters not with wealth or threat, but with memory. She reminded England who she was, the daughter of a queen, the child of the Spanish lioness who had once ruled beside Henry as his equal, and the people, wearied of scheming lords and pale heirs, lifted her back to the throne. She ruled fiercely. Some said harshly. She returned England to the Church of Rome, burning those who defied her in flames that lit the gray skies with fear. Her enemies called her Bloody Mary. But perhaps what they truly meant was Mary, who remembered, Mary who would not forgive. Mary, who burned not only heretics, but the ghosts of everything her father had done to her mother. She ruled for 5 years, and then, like her brother, died without a child. The bloodline Henry had bled so many women to secure seemed, again, on the edge of ruin. But then came Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, child of scandal, the girl born into whispers and raised in a court that watched her like a shadow. She had been declared illegitimate, her mother condemned and forgotten. And yet she learned to survive. She studied, she listened, she kept her head low and her mind sharp. And when Mary died, Elizabeth stepped into power, not with fire, but with light. She became the monarch Henry never imagined. The ruler he perhaps feared, a woman not governed by marriage, not consumed by heirs, not shaped by passion, but by control. She never married. She called herself married to England, and under her, the country grew strong, feared, respected. The Queen ruled for over 40 years, outlasting threats, plots, rebellions, and storms, standing calm and golden, like a sun carved into stone. And so, the great irony, Henry had broken a 1,000-year union with the Catholic Church for a son. He had annulled, abandoned, and executed to craft a male heir who could carry his name across centuries. And yet, it was his daughters, the ones he had doubted, demoted, and feared who would shape England's future. It was Mary who reminded the kingdom of faith and vengeance. It was Elizabeth who rebuilt it into power. It was the women, not the boy, who made the Tudor name eternal. Meanwhile, Henry lay beneath the stones of St. George's Chapel in Windsor, beside Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him the son that fate refused to let him keep. His tomb was grand in plan, modest in reality. The monument he had envisioned, a massive shrine of marble and gold, with effigies and eternal flames, was never built. The wars he began, the debts he amassed, the silence he left behind drained the coffers long before his vision could rise. He was buried in haste, in a vault he shared not only with Jane, but eventually with Charles I, and centuries later, 2 kings whose bodies would rest together, though their reigns could not have been more different. But it was not the tomb that failed to hold his story. It was time. Because Henry, for all his grandeur, was not a man easy to bury. His shadow stretched through law, through church, through myth. His face appeared on tapestries and coins, on paintings hung in palaces, in schoolbooks and stages. Some remembered him as the builder of ships, the patron of the arts, the man who brought England into the modern age. Others remembered the scaffold, the broken vows, the queens left hollow-eyed and silent. He was both, and neither, and more. What Henry VIII truly left behind was a country no longer ruled by popes, no longer wed to tradition, if no longer afraid of change, a country that had seen its king destroy everything in order to possess it. He tore down abbeys. He melted the bells of monasteries into cannonballs. He stripped gold from altars and turned saints into rubble. All so he could name himself supreme, and the people, who had once cheered him as their golden prince, and now spoke of him in lowered tones, as if afraid he might still be listening. Even century later, his name carries weight, not for his laws, nor his victories, but for the strange, haunted brilliance of his reign, the way love turned to law, and law to death, and death into legend. His was a crown that did not rest, a reign that did not sleep, and though his bones lie cold beneath Windsor's floor, his story moves still in the letters he wrote, the heads he ordered struck from shoulders, the girls he tried to silence who became queens, and the church that still bears his mark in every hymn sung beneath English ceilings. The tomb was too small, the crown too heavy, the man too vast to measure. There is a kind of silence that follows a great storm, not peace, but aftermath, not calm, but echo. And when the reign of Henry VIII finally ended in the year 1547, the kingdom did not collapse, nor did it rejoice. It simply paused, as if holding its breath in the dark, waiting for the sound of footsteps that would no longer come. The man who had ruled for nearly 4 decades, who had written himself into the flesh and stone of England with ink, blood, and fire, was gone, and yet his presence lingered, not just in palaces or policies, but in the strange heaviness that hung over a people unsure of what had been real, the king who had promised glory but delivered so much loss, the husband who had written love letters like poems and then signed death warrants like errands, the prince who had wanted to be adored but died feared, half-rotted, whispering orders no one could bear to follow. In those final years, he could not sleep, not well, not deeply, not as kings are imagined to sleep wrapped in fur, safe beneath banners, with the soft hush of loyal guards outside. No. Henry's nights were broken by pain, by fevers that soaked his sheets, by the stench of ulcers in his leg that would not heal, by the weight of a body too swollen for its bones and too hollowed by age to remember the rush of youth. He had once danced through halls with a lute in hand, golden hair catching firelight, and now he grunted to rise, groaned to breathe, snarled at servants who flinched at the smell of death that clung to his chamber. His courtiers began to speak in low voices, not just out of respect, but out of dread, as if naming him too clearly would call him forth from some cavernous place between madness and memory. And yet, the king still gave orders, even bedridden, even oozing blood and bile. He reached for control. He revised successions. He summoned his children Edward, the fragile boy, Mary, the devout flame, and Elizabeth, the quiet storm. He gave them trinkets and titles and expectations, as if legacy could be measured out like wine, poured into the right cups, and made everlasting. But nothing lasts, not even kings, especially not kings who mistake noise for love, power for loyalty, and appetite for strength. Some nights, the candles in his room were left burning, not for grandeur, but because he feared the dark, not the physical dark. No man who had ordered so many deaths could fear shadows, but the dark inside him, the memories, the faces, the quiet. He had created a world in which no one dared contradict him. And in doing so, he had exiled himself from the only truth that matters, that even a king cannot outrun what he has done. And so the ghosts came. Anne Boleyn, with her clever smile and swift death. Catherine Howard, eyes wide and terrified. Jane Seymour, appalling childbirth. Thomas More, executed for conscience. Cromwell, who had built the empire and been discarded like a meal gone cold. They came to him not in visions but in the spaces between pain, the gaps between breath and silence, and in those gaps, Henry was not a monarch. He was a man, crumbling beneath the weight of all he had summoned and destroyed. And yet, beyond his chamber, the country dreamed, not of him, not always, but through him. Because Henry had changed the shape of England's soul, He had torn it from Rome, rewritten the Mass, renamed the sacred. He had burned saints and crowned queens, and made the church bend to a single man's desire. And though the people grumbled, and sometimes revolted, they adapted, they endured, they rebuilt their prayers in new tongues, learned new hymns, and wore their confusion like a cloak against the wind. England did not sleep during Henry's reign. It shifted, restlessly, beneath the pull of his decisions. And long after he died, that restlessness remained. In the villages, the farmers still spoke of the old monasteries, now turned to ruins. In the cities, merchants recalled the coins stamped with his face, heavier than most, his eyes always watching. In the court, no one said his name unless they had to. He had become a figure of caution, of warning, of awe, not quite myth, not quite memory, just presence. And in time, that presence changed shape. He became the king with 6 wives, the one who made jokes of marriage and nursery rhymes out of execution, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, a chant, a game, a simplification that children recited in schoolyards without knowing what it truly meant, what it cost. But the real cost was not just blood. It was silence. The silence of queens who never wrote their truths. The silence of subjects, too afraid to speak. The silence that filled the halls of Hampton Court and Whitehall after his death, when even the guards walked softer. That was the kingdom. Henry left a place more powerful, more centralized, more feared than ever, but one that had learned, deeply, how to hide its pain. And in Windsor, beneath the chapel where choirs still sing and tourists still gaze upward, his body rests, with Jane Seymour beside him, not out of love, but because she died before he could stop loving her. His coffin, cracked by time, carries more than bone. It carries contradiction. A man who loved music, yet silenced voices. A man who prayed, yet burned saints. A man who longed for peace, yet made war on his own court. A man who wrote letters filled with hearts, and then signed the orders to end those hearts forever. That is what lies beneath the stone. That is what England still walks upon. So if you find yourself one night, unable to sleep, and you feel the weight of decisions pressing on your chest, not royal ones, not eternal ones, but the quiet questions we all carry, remember the king who built a world in which no one could tell him no, and ask yourself whether power without love is anything more than hunger in a crown. Because in the end, it was not the throne, nor the titles, nor even the son he left behind that mattered most. It was the daughters forgotten, underestimated, almost erased, who rose from the ashes of his ambition and ruled not with rage, but with resilience. And it was the people, the ones who baked bread, wrote poems, and sang lullabies, who carried his kingdom forward, step by step, dream by dream, never fully free of his shadow, but always walking beyond it. Sleep now, England. Your king is gone, but the stories remain.